My name is Dr. G. Welcome to That's Unusual, my podcast uncovering the unusual stories behind the world's most interesting people. On this show, we celebrate what makes us different and how we convert those differences into unexpected opportunities. Welcome to this week's episode of That's Unusual. If you haven't done so already, I'd greatly appreciate it if you could go and subscribe to this podcast using your favorite podcast player, whether it be iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. And while you're there, leave me a review. It helps me out a great deal. Thank you. My guest today is Dr. Ronnie Zeiger, a physician turned entrepreneur who was the former chief health strategist at Google, and actually one of their first. Currently, he's the co-founder and CEO of Smart Patients, an online community where patients and their families learn from one another. Ronnie has been a leading voice for patients, having shared his views across prominent stages like TEDMED, amongst many others. On today's episode, we get up and close and personal, where Ronnie shares his journey from practicing doctor to leading the change in health at Google. We discuss the importance of rapid experimentation and willingness to fail along the way. Ronnie shares key entrepreneurial lessons learned from his tenure with Google, including those associated with Google Flu Trends and Personal Health Record, and how that ultimately helped him shape his networked community model for his current venture, Smart Patients. As you listen to this episode, I ask that you reflect on your own unusual stories and unique qualities that can help open doors to unexpected opportunities. And so with that, let's get started. Welcome to That's Unusual. Today, I have as my guest, Dr. Ronnie Zeiger. Welcome to the show, Ronnie. Great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to jump right in here and get to know who Ronnie is, because you've done some fascinating stuff over the course of your career. And you've also been known to write from time to time. And I actually perused some of your articles that you've written on your website and your blog. And I came across a really interesting one that was titled, When Superpower Meets Super Passion. So I think that is a perfect place to start. Tell us about, what was the crux of that piece and where you derive your superpowers and your super passions.
Sure. Let's just start off talking about my superpowers. What could be more comfortable than that? So I think one of my most recent and most firmly held beliefs in terms of how we live our lives, both professionally and personally, but especially professionally, is that each of us has certain things that we are best at and certain things that we care the most about. And I think the secret is to find the intersection of those two and do that. I talk to my kids about this a lot. My kids are 9 and 12. And one of the things that I most want to impart upon them is that, not that many decades ago, there weren't a whole lot of choices on what we were supposed to be able to do professionally. You could list a dozen common jobs. But now, all of a sudden, just in the last, few years, there are no rules.
That's right.
You can do almost anything. And if you're creative enough and lucky enough, you can figure out how to do that for a living. And so in a way, that makes it kind of overwhelming and challenging compared to taking a multiple choice test on what you want to do for your profession. But if you can embrace that, then wow, what an exciting time to be alive.
Fully agree. And I think, there's certainly so many opportunities that are out there. And you've kind of carved your own path forward, being a physician and having multiple stints in a different corporate environment, now being an entrepreneur. And you wrote this other piece talking about how you actually like to sit at the juncture in the road, the fork in the road at that very intersection. And to quote verbatim again from one of your TEDMED talks that you delivered a few years ago, your opening line verbatim was, "My path has been an unusual one." And so, of course, that's unusual. So I need to find out more. Tell everybody about, what intersections have come along your journey and how did you carve your way forward into what you're doing today?
You make me want to explain something that's going to sound unrelated at first. And it's one of the things that I think is broken about the way we do healthcare today. So pretend you're with me when I'm moonlighting in the urgent care clinic, which I still get to do from time to time. And we're seeing a patient who's got an annoying cough that just won't go away. We've already tried the usual things. We've done the basic tests and we haven't figured it out and it's not getting better. So the question is, do we refer them to the pulmonologist or the ENT doctor or the gastroenterologist or somebody else? And the answer is, we don't know. That's the whole point. And yet our system is designed so that we have to make that decision now. And we may end up having to back out of it and try a different path. But we have these sets of rules that we tend to work in probably most of our industries. I happen to understand healthcare more than I understand most others. And I'm seeing that all the fun stuff and a lot of the new things, the innovations, the discoveries happen at the intersection of two spaces, especially spaces that didn't used to be connected. So, today a lot of people are talking about artificial intelligence in medicine, or, art and mental illness. And these are things that we don't typically, or we didn't used to typically think about together. But when you get really creative energy and smart people who realize that they'd like to solve the same problem by making their interests and skills and discoveries complementary to each other and apply them to the same context, that's where we get to leapfrog in terms of innovation and problem solving. For me, it's been totally accidental. So I grew up in Silicon Valley, although I didn't really think of myself as doing that. Slightly nerdy kid, but I was more interested in science than in math and computers. And I ended up thinking I was going to be a molecular biologist, and then transitioned from there to clinical medicine. And then I got to medical school and residency and felt like I had gone back a couple centuries because I was growing up.
Did you grow up in a healthcare environment?
No. Well, so my dad's a plant biologist, now retired, and my mom is a psychologist. So kind of a science and somewhat of a health focus, but not medicine. I don't have any, at least no close relatives who are in medicine. So all of a sudden, I had sort of what I thought was the normal world of technology that I had grown up in. I started medical school in 1994, and things were getting pretty interesting from a consumer technology perspective. I had a Palm Pilot in my pocket, for example.
I did too.
Yeah, but that technology was nowhere to be found in my medical training. And so that kind of became my specialty informally. And I kept on thinking about what was going on in the consumer technology world could be applied to medicine. And that is just one example of an intersection. But those are, when I meet people who are in a totally different field, I love talking about, what they do and thinking about how it overlaps with things that I'm interested in and that they're interested in. And, I think, the term cross-disciplinary isn't new, but I think it's sexy again.
Yeah, I think that's a thesis that we fully believe here with Unusual. And we have, of course, an annual event series that's actually called Unusual Intersections, which is designed to sort of cross-pollinate ideas from different industries to solve common problems. But I think you're spot on, especially when you were talk to us about that era when you were in medical school and Silicon Valley was just coming to fruition in terms of the mainstream consumer technologies. The internet was just coming a buzz. What was that like for you coming through medical school and coming through residency and sort of seeing the blend between healthcare and technology?
You just kind of accidentally made me think of a particular moment. And I was just seeing my first patients as a medical student. And I remember being nervous about a tentative decision I had made to pull out my Palm Pilot in front of a patient. And I had an app that it was barely an app. It was a little, really not much more than a document that was the ATP3 cholesterol guidelines. And it talked about risk for heart attack, depending on various risk factors. And I wanted to bring it out because it was relevant to a discussion I was having with the patient, and I wasn't sure what would happen. Would that be okay? Would they think like, oh my God, this guy, this doctor in training, he knows so little. He has to pull out a computer while we're talking. I mean, come on.
Right.
But I went for it, and we both looked at it together, and it was such a great experience because it was like we were learning and discussing together. And the reaction I got was, that's so great that you trust me to pull out kind of the latest information and have us discuss it. And you're comfortable with not having this memorized, because the point isn't to memorize things. The point is to know where things are and know what should get discussed when. So I mean, think about how funny is it to reflect back on being nervous about pulling up an electronic resource in front of a patient. That's what it was like then, and none of my supervising doctors were doing that. It was still an era where people were bringing, printed journal articles to rounds and to the clinic to discuss. So that's kind of what the environment was like then for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's so radically different from today's environment where, technology is almost an expected piece of the conversation as we talk to patients. Of course, now we're trying to make it a little bit less friction in the environment. But, that was at a time where all of these young internet companies were propping up. And of course, Google was having its, initial early days during that time of the year and you, of course, went to go work for Google as your chief health strategist. Walk us through that time period between, when you were in medical school and ultimately how you ended up at Google.
So I went through medical school. I wanted to be a primary care doctor. So I then went to UCSF for a primary care internal medicine residency.
Now, let's stop there for a second, because primary care, if I recall, so I went to medical school starting in 96, and everything at that point in time was everybody was going after the specialties, right? Because that's where the money was. That's where their prestige was. It was really sexy. Why did you go down the path or have interest in the primary care at that time?
Thinking about the possibility, for example, of seeing a heart patient and then another heart patient and then another heart patient, I couldn't think of anything more limiting and boring. I love the variety that general medicine provides.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, especially as I grew into it a little bit more, the variety of stories. It is such, it sounds cliche, but I do a few urgent care shifts a month, and those days, they're stressful, that's for sure. But getting to walk into a whole bunch of rooms and have people who I usually don't have any previous relationship with, for it to be normal for them to essentially bare their souls and share their stories with me, that's it's just sort of this awesome piece of humanity that I get to be in touch with. And that's absolutely can be part of any specialty. But for me, both from a personal and an intellectual perspective, having that be of the widest spectrum of stories and challenges was kind of an obvious direction.
Yeah, and for those who know you, I mean, that's that's probably one of your magical superpower qualities, as well as your ability to listen to other people, something that I've seen in you over the course of the years of having known you, and your fascination with the stories that these patients have to tell, which actually has a lot to do with what you're doing currently today with smart patients, which we'll get to in a couple of minutes. But I did interrupt you, so you were talking about your path towards Google, so please continue.
Sure. So I was practicing full-time, half primary care, half urgent care. And I had been doing that sort of technical stuff really just as a hobby. I was the guy that people asked, hey, what's on your Palm Pilot? And later your Palm, when the pilot was removed from the name. Not too long after that, it was fancier devices. But that didn't become a formal part of my life, of my profession. But I was working full-time, and I missed that piece. And I also felt like I was working in a system where I wasn't having nearly as much impact as I'd hoped. In many ways, I felt like I was putting Band-Aids on pretty massive, complex problems. Mm-hmm. So the professional satisfaction wasn't really there. And the clinic where I was working, the other attending, Friday afternoons, we would supervise Stanford internal medicine residents during their primary care rotation. And the other attending physician on that Friday afternoon happened to run the Stanford Biomedical Informatics training program. Mm-hmm. And he told me, 6 months of Friday afternoons working together, he said, Ronnie, all this stuff that you're interested in, it's called medical informatics. You don't actually know very much about it. You should go back to school. And I said, actually, I can't repeat here on air what I said. It would be inappropriate to our younger listeners. And so I said, I think I've been in school quite long enough. But he got me thinking, and I ended up taking a break from full-time medicine. I thought it was a temporary break. It turned out to be a permanent break. So I became a part-time urgent care doctor, went back to school to get some formal training in computer science and its application to healthcare. And then as I was finishing that master's program, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I already lived in Mountain View, and I like to ride my bike. And like the 100th time that I rode through the Google campus, I said, wait a second, what if I could get Google to hire me with its footprint and the way that people are already using that search box for their health information needs? That could be spectacular.
And this was what year?
This was 2005.
Okay, so still relatively early in terms of the footprint that Google has made.
When I joined, it was a 6,000 person company.
Okay.
And then when I left in 2012, it was a 40-something thousand person.
Jeez. Okay, so you passed by the campus. What did you do? You just walk in the door and speak to someone, or?
Not too far off. I figured out that, that someone I know works at Google, and they figured out the person I should talk to. And I got myself invited to give a talk there. And that led to a consulting offer, which led to a full-time job offer.
So at that time, did Google actually have a healthcare division, or was it something that they were toying around with? Or how did you obviously became the chief health strategist. Was it something that you worked up to, or was that just sort of a post that they developed for you because they said that they were interested in getting in healthcare?
So kind of in between those scenarios. So when I first started talking with them, there wasn't anything formal going on. By the time I got hired full time, there were a couple of people beginning to work on what became Google Health. Mm-hmm. And so I joined that team. And then, over the course of the 6 years that I was there, a whole bunch of things evolved, many of which failed, some of which succeeded, and which continue to iterate today. Google, as you probably know, is not the most open company about what it does, what its plans are, and that's true of most companies. Google and Apple both have that reputation of being a little bit secretive. So I was part of a very early team there. I think there were 3 of us when I joined, and boy, was it like being a kid in a candy store.
So, of course, you're most noted for having your hands in developing what is Google Flu Trends. But before we get to describing what that is, what were some of the things that you mentioned that were failures in your box? What I'm sure at that early stages of the intersection between technology and healthcare, and specifically search and internet and healthcare, a lot of it was experiments. What did you learn in the course of your 6 years working at Google from the failures that you experienced?
Well, I got even more comfortable with operating in the face of uncertainty. And actually, I think that's probably, to the extent that I might have a superpower, it might be being comfortable with uncertainty. Mm-hmm. Frankly, that's what practicing medicine is all about, which is a little bit of a scary concept, but there's so much more that we don't know than we know. And navigating that in the context of very real, impactful issues that affect people's health is a fascinating and terrifying concept. And so we have to be comfortable with the notion that we are always learning and iterating and never going to get it exactly right. I think the most prominent public failure that I was involved with at Google was the personal health record project, which was called Google Health. And, there's no way to know for sure why it didn't work, because you don't get to, run a randomized set of experiments to do it a bunch of different ways. A lot of people think it was too early. I'm not sure about that. I think that we had a great underlying philosophy and concept, but we didn't formulate it into really specific user problems that we could solve 100% of the way. Mm-hmm. One example which comes to mind is, if I were going to do that kind of thing again, I would pick a subset of the consumer health experience, like managing prescriptions, and make it super easy, not just to track your prescriptions, but to know when they're going to run out and to, magically request a refill, maybe like the way Amazon does with those silly but awesome buttons that you can put in your house, like next to the laundry machine. You just get a button and you just press it when your laundry detergent's almost out, and magically Amazon ships you another bottle. So getting much deeper into a narrower use case, I think would have, in retrospect, been a better strategy, but we tried to do a lot. And I think we solved a bunch of problems 80% of the way, but 80% isn't nearly good enough when you want to, get people to really embrace something and change their behavior. So that's probably the biggest failure. But gosh, we're talking about failures almost every single day, because you're doing things that are new, and it's almost the goal is to see how fast you can fail, because with every attempt at doing something, if you're paying attention, comes potentially useful insight.
And that's part of the embedded culture within Google, right? Is also to allow people to experiment and to celebrate failures in terms of the learnings that you can apply for your future benefit. What was the culture like at Google at that time? I mean, being one of even among 6,000, people, employees that were at Google, and you were just a handful of people running this healthcare division, how are you foreseen within that type of environment?
Well, so important grain of salt, this was my first job at a company. I had only worked as a full-time person. I had done, some consulting projects and built some software on the side. But in terms of having a real job, this is my first one. So I have to kind of fill in some of the blanks as I've had a little more experience since then. But it was I thought it was huge. I didn't realize what a bigger company really felt like until many years later. It was kind of like being an entrepreneur. Everyone in the company had the opportunity to be an entrepreneur. There were, of course, rules and constraints and budgets. But if you really wanted to do something, all you had to do was convince other people that it was the thing that we should do.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a common phrase that says, in order to become a successful entrepreneur, the best way to start is to become a successful intrapreneur. So to some degree, you were an intrapreneur within Google, starting up new business units, then perhaps made you a more effective and successful entrepreneur once you left Google and did your own thing with Smart Patients and so forth. So, looking back at the course of your time at Google, are there things that you would have done differently or things that you took along with you that you learned ultimately to develop Smart Patients, or what came thereafter once you left Google?
I probably would have done everything differently. It's hard to summarize. You get better at things the more time you spend doing them usually, and you get more confident and you have more perspective. So I think, I don't know, I sometimes feel like all of this work is this endless attempt to balance patience and impatience. And, there are things that are going to take a decade to get done, and that requires an unbelievable amount of patience. And there are things that should only take 1 week to do, and you should refuse to do them unless your collaborators allow you to get them done in the short amount of time that you can. So I don't think I would have had the courage to start Smart Patients had it not been for my experiences at Google and understanding, how to build software at scale, and really getting deep learning in the world of user experience research.
Do you believe the traditional culture of Silicon Valley of typically move fast and break things, it just isn't set up properly to create transformation within healthcare? Because healthcare, as we all know, is sort of, like our friend Jordan Schlane always says, is move slow and don't kill people. And that seems so counterintuitive to how Silicon Valley typically functions. How is that balance being achieved, or have you seen it sort of evolve over the course of time?
Yeah, I don't buy that. I think it just takes creativity, like everywhere else. And, there certainly are big challenges in that healthcare is a big thing that's been around for a long time. And so there are a lot of different aspects of inertia. But, if I come up with, and others are doing this right now, if we come up with a thoughtful approach using a bunch of different data inputs and some machine learning to better predict when we're about to get slammed in the ER, so that we can call in for extra resources a half an hour before that.
Mm-hmm.
You can sell that service today, and it exists, right? It only, people are doing that as of just the last couple years, and healthcare isn't saying, "Oh, wait, no, that's too new." Healthcare is saying, like, "Oh, we wouldn't have thought of that, but you can show me it works, and it helps us, and it's safe, and it's cost effective. Let's go." So you just have to be creative and persistent.
I've heard over and over again that there's always like these two schools of thoughts, right? It's like, one camp believes that, well, in order to innovate in healthcare, you need to understand all of the intricacies that exist within healthcare and the historical structures around how the system is designed. And then there's another camp that basically says, well, the only way to transform healthcare is to sort of come in from the outside and break things and not necessarily look at the existing assumptions and rules. Do you fall anywhere in those camps?
I think both of those are unnecessarily limiting. People aren't saying the same thing about finance. I don't think anyone or at least not nearly as many people pretend to have religion about whether innovation in the payment space has to come from someone who has been in the banking world or has to come from someone who has not been in the banking world.
Mm-hmm.
People will probably there's a potentially slightly different set of patterns that people are more likely to resonate with, or someone's more likely to have an insight that can disrupt from the inside. If they have experience in the space, someone may be more likely to have an idea that uses a completely different set of assumptions if they come from the outside. And they might have the exact same approach. So I think those constructs are really limiting.
Let me rephrase it in a different way. So I, of course, give a lot of talks in front of big pharma companies. Do you think that we'll see greater disruption and transformation coming from existing players like Pfizer's and Merck's and GSK's of the world? Or do you think it'll be the future potential competition coming from the Googles and Amazons and Microsofts of the world?
Yes.
Yes to both. Okay.
So they have different core competencies, different kinds of risk tolerances, different willingnesses to experiment in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Pfizer's much more likely to acquire a certain kind of startup than Google is. Google's more likely to build a certain kind of prototype than Pfizer is. I don't think it's possible to categorically say which one will win in that sort of hypothetical head-to-head. It is clear that Pfizer and Lilly and all the rest of those companies, they're not going to exist in the way they are today, 15 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not clear to me whether they are going to be able to transform themselves
mm-hmm.
or whether they will get totally disrupted. And I think the answer is going to be some of each, as is the case in most industries.
Okay, fair enough. All right, let's talk about some of the current stuff that you're doing with Smart Patients. And, you talk about it as kind of a network of micro experts. So, without me, talking too much about it, why don't you explain it in your own words? And, what was it that sort of gave you the impetus and sort of that aha moment to say, hey, there's something that's been missing in our environment that we need to address?
So, it's in retrospect, of course, it's incredibly straightforward. And I was shielded from this fascinating world, partly because I grew up inside a path of medical training, which was pretty traditional and pretty paternalistic, or in a less judgmental way, very expert-centric. We live in a very expert-centric culture,
mm-hmm.
and certainly in healthcare. And I happened to be, while I was at Google, I started getting exposed to online patient communities. And most of them have been and are on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And started seeing how patients and families can support each other in ways that we don't really think about in healthcare. We think of, as medical providers or as parts of the broader biomedical system, we think of the answers coming from the system and being given to the patients and families, and the patients being the recipients of care, the subjects of trials. So that's a very powerfully loaded term, I think. And we don't think about peer-to-peer very much in healthcare. And I just got exposed to this really quite accidentally when I was at Google and got obsessed.
Mm-hmm.
As a clinician and as a wannabe problem solver in the healthcare space, I just saw this massive underutilized resource for patients and families, which is other patients and families. And I've been polling clinicians for the last couple of years. I've probably polled 10,000 people by now. And I asked them, usually in groups, how many of you have ever introduced one of your patients to another one of your patients? And it's significantly less, at least in this country, it's significantly less than 1%.
Wow.
And it's not because we've had a thoughtful discussion about this and decided it's a bad idea. There's some knee-jerk responses about privacy, but that's a red herring. The legal framework for introducing two patients to each other is ask both of them permission first. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
So really, we're talking about a cultural issue, and it's not part of our training. It's not how we think. And we realize that patients might talk to each other in the waiting room or online, but we think of that as almost like, I hope they're not, misinforming each other in some way. It's a very old school mentality we typically have, and we haven't broken out of it in large scale because the culture hasn't shifted in that direction.
But is there an inherent risk for patients essentially sharing their researched advice to each other? I mean, because they're not really, I mean, physicians for the most part, or let's just say experts in the healthcare field, are what we'd like to think are trained to understand what is true evidence versus what is, perhaps something that has not yet been proven. How do we ensure that those patient-to-patient conversations are truly grounded in evidence-based research and not just sort of hearsay? Or maybe it doesn't matter.
It matters. You can't. And there is evidence that peer support is helpful in many situations. And I'll give you a slightly snarky and hopefully provocative answer, which is, what percentage of conversations between clinicians and patients today do you think are grounded in evidence?
Not as much as it should be.
Yeah. So we're talking about a very imperfect system and a massively underutilized resource, which, if utilized thoughtfully, can help a huge amount of people both effectively and inexpensively.
Yeah, it's kind of like, for the most part, historically, we've always what I like to call the difference between effectiveness versus efficacy, because for the most part, clinicians practice a base of medicine that is grounded in their historical experience in treating those patients and not necessarily what the latest evidence or science tells them it should be.
And I think the question is even harder than that. One of my kind of slaps in the face when I finished residency, and I did my training at a very fancy institution, UC San Francisco, at what one could argue was kind of the pinnacle of our belief in the savior of evidence-based medicine, which I strongly believe in. But then I learned, only when I got into practice, was that maybe 1 in 10 of the decisions that we make in practice, for maybe 10% of those situations, does there even exist evidence that we can use? So it's not simply a matter of doing it, it's a matter of whether it's possible. And the reality is, there are a lot of subtle, complex, personal issues where a huge amount of judgment is required, and for which there doesn't exist sufficient evidence to guide us.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads me to believe that to make those kinds of decisions in a way that makes, I'll give you a quick example. My dad, a couple months ago, had a hip replacement surgery. They should be lucky to have a doctor as a son who could help guide them through it. And I hopefully helped a lot. One of the things that I couldn't help with, my mom is in better health than my dad is.
Mm-hmm.
And she, in most ways takes care of him. She had no idea what to expect for after the surgery. They told him, you'll probably be able to get out of the hospital really fast, and very unlikely you'll need to go to a nursing home. And he said that sounded great. And she thought that sounded terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what I couldn't do? I couldn't introduce her to another caregiver of someone who had recently had a hip replacement surgery to talk about what it was like when he came back home.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, because the healthcare is much more than just the patient itself or just the physician themselves. It's everyone that sort of surrounds and touches the patient to some degree, either directly or indirectly, that gets impacted. So how is Smart Patients solving for a lot of this?
Well, we're working on it. And the process is really simple. It's really just about helping people connect to other patients and or families who are going through similar things, have been through similar things, or have related questions, and doing a lot of, it's half software engineering, which is just having built a really good and every week getting better platform that's designed specifically for health-focused communities. And it's half social engineering, which is, how do you build a good quality community from day one? How do you nurture that? How do you help people feel comfortable asking questions? How do you help those questions get answered by the community in a respectful, consistent way? And how do you build that system so that it complements and is integrated with the healthcare delivery system and is not another silo that's separated from it?
And so how do you do that?
Well, if I could tell you, then we'd be done. So we're definitely still figuring it out. So a lot of it is experience. So among our team, we probably have 50 plus years of experience building and managing online communities. And so we have kind of our internal knowledge and culture of how to do that. The software platform, it changes, every Wednesday we release a new version of the site, and it keeps getting better. It's the small things that matter. I mean, there's a lot of basics you got to take care of, but.
And do people predominantly engage via their computer, either their mobile device or desktop?
Yeah, so it's mobile is actually the dominant form factor that people use if you include tablets in that. But it's all online, all asynchronous written conversations. You can embed images and videos, although most people don't. That turns out to be a really interestingly successful mechanism because especially people who are sick and trying to be a mom at the same time and hold down a job at the same time, and they're not all available at the same time. So some people, use it at 6 o'clock in the morning. Some people use it at midnight, but they're part of these same and interestingly overlapping communities, and they're just learning from each other. And we work pretty tirelessly to keep those conversations flowing, to keep them on track once in a while when necessary. So there's a lot of kind of social engineering going on, mostly behind the scenes.
So is there a moderator sort of scanning the type of information that's being shared back and forth? Is there a way that you address essentially quality control in terms of those information that they're sharing?
There is, although probably not in the way that some might guess. Our goal, so let's say someone is going to say something that's just obviously factually incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
My goal is not to prevent that from happening. I would much rather that get posted and then promptly a thoughtful member of the community saying something like, hey, welcome to the community. You're not alone. And you know what? I'm worried about what you said, and here's why. And for a light to get shined on it that everyone can learn from.
So a little bit of a self-policing strategy that seems to have sort of unfolded within the community itself, that people essentially become their own checks and balances when you have enough people in the network.
If the community is functioning well, absolutely. And you need to make it so that a significant portion of the community has skin in the game, that they really care about the community. And so they care about its quality. And that becomes part of the overall quality control approach.
Now, are you guys just oncology focused right now?
No, we started in oncology, but maybe 2 years in, so now at least 2 years ago, we broadened. We're doing, everything from postpartum depression to inflammatory bowel disease to this year we're doing a lot of work. Two big growth areas right now are autoimmune diseases and dementia, especially focused on caregivers. So we're doing a lot of work now for family members of people who are affected by dementia and a variety of other issues.
Now, does that mean that an individual already has to be diagnosed and understand how to best use the platform? Or, for example, they say, I think I might have inflammatory bowel disease. Maybe I should go on Smart Patients and see how other people are describing their condition.
So people come in through a potentially different doors. So you can come in through kind of the regular front door at smartpatients.com and we'll ask you, which community are you looking for? But you can also you don't have to know, you can just post something in the community and our team will help you figure that out. A lot of people end up finding the inflammatory bowel disease sign up page and just come straight through that door. And then we don't need to ask you what community, you're just dropped right into it. And then there's a lot of conversations that cut across communities. And that's an increasingly important part of the design of the platform because, that anecdote that we talked about earlier in this conversation, the person who has a cough, are they in the reflux community? Are they in the asthma community?
Yeah.
And they may not know, and they may not ever know. So a conversation can be about cough, and it can cut across the communities. The platform is tag-based, so any given conversation can actually include people from a variety of traditionally defined communities.
And are you mining this information and this data? And if so, what do you plan on doing with it?
Not really. We're learning from it, but it's interesting. I've become a little bit of a fuddy-duddy about big data and data mining, not because it's not important and doesn't have a huge amount of potential to help us learn, but there are a lot of really smart people working on those problems. And I think a much more interesting and understudied opportunity is what people know. So I'm much more interested in being able to ask the community explicitly a question, just like members of the community do, about, hey, what do you think about XYZ? And learn from those explicit conversations than I am in mining the data that they're producing in the kind of traditional data mining sense. And I think that's part of the overall thesis, if you will, here, that if we connect patients and families in this way, we're also creating kind of the world's best ever patient advisory board. If you will.
Look at it, yeah.
And that's how we work with medical centers. We make it easy for them to offer their patients a high quality, well understood peer support option. And we let them tap into their own patients in a way that they haven't been able to do before, because those patients love it when you respectfully ask them questions about how to serve them better.
And we're certainly empowering patients in ways that we've never even imagined before in our system, which I think is beneficial all around in terms of looking at positive outcomes. Are there any, and I'm sort of putting you on the spot here in terms of success stories, is there any story that you can share, of course, without violating any HIPAA rules, that you can share coming from your community in Smart Patients?
Probably not the kind of success story you had in mind, but I'll just share with you one that I shared with my family the other night. A member of our kidney cancer community posted the other day saying that it's his 10-year cancerversary, anniversary of his diagnosis, and reminded people a little bit about his journey and explicitly called us out, the Smart Patients team, for being part of, his team, his family. And I'm not sure what we've done for him specifically, other than give him a place to learn from each other, and a lot of people have learned from him. He has over those years, sent me a picture of him and I forget if it was 5 or 6 of his grandchildren eating ice cream together.
Well, you're giving him those extra dinner moments back with his family. That's huge success right there, right? Giving those extra.
And just share, it's about sharing. We've, hopefully indirectly helped him, and he's helped a bunch of people, and we all have a richer life experience as a result.
Yeah. Well, it's great. I'd imagine you're probably going to come away with tons of stories out of that platform. So you're now coming up, I believe, on the 5-year anniversary from when Smart Patients was founded. Is that correct?
Close, yeah. We're a couple of weeks away from turning 4 from when we launched the service.
The actual site. So what, sort of at this juncture, what do you see next for Smart Patients, or for what you're doing with the community?
So for me, the big exciting question is back to the underlying goal, which is integration with the healthcare system. What I kind of, a surrogate marker of success for me that I'm most proud of so far is that we've helped cause a whole bunch of clinicians, at this point in the hundreds, I think, to prescribe peer support. And so what I want to do now is add a couple of zeros to that, both by making peer support work better and helping the healthcare system take advantage of that resource.
Yeah. That's great. And it circles back to your original question that you were polling physicians with. How many patients have you introduced to each other? And I think your technology is now at a position to be able to enable that connection to happen in an integrated system. So it's fascinating. I love it. I love following the progress and tracking the progress of Smart Patients and what you're up to. I think this is a great segue into sort of our conclusion of our conversation, which is typically where I ask guests a series of spontaneous, rapid fire, Mad Lib fill in the blanks. So if you're cool with it, we'll get started on those 5 questions.
Bring it on.
All right. So the first one is, the best piece of advice I ever received was?
I'll call a slight audible. And my daughter, when she was probably a few years ago, she was probably 8. I was sharing with her at bedtime something about what I was doing. And she asked me, why does that matter? And she didn't mean to be challenging me, but she was, and she continues to.
So always asking sort of the why of the equation, right?
Yeah, just from a focus perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice coming from your daughter. All right, next one for you. I am most curious about
how people learn from other people's stories.
Yeah. And it's certainly reflecting in everything that you're doing. All right, next one for you. If you had to write an autobiography, of course, about yourself, the title of the book would be?
God forbid I ever write an autobiography.
Was that the title, or is that what you're telling me?
I'm not sure.
Or it could be both. All right. So is that the title?
I guess so.
So I take it you'd never write a book, or no, even if you did have to write a book about yourself, it would be something.
I hope it wouldn't be very much about me if something like that happened.
Mine would probably be about 3 pages long, so it wouldn't be. All right, next one for you. If you could invite 3 people over for dinner, dead or alive, who would you invite, and what would you want to talk about?
Atul Gawande, Abraham Varghese, and John Lennon.
All right. So 2 healthcare, 1 entertainment musician. Explain.
3 philosophers.
3 philosophers. Okay. So that's the common thread here. So what would you want to talk about?
I don't know. We just jam.
Yeah, that would certainly be an interesting conversation. So I love all 3. I think that's a great pick. All right, last one for you, Ronnie. On this podcast, of course, we celebrate everything that makes us unique, what makes us different. It's something that we call unusual. So if you had to fill in the following blank, how would you do so? I'm unusual because...
Oh, so I have a problem with the premise. I think our most important attributes need to be defined by others because we're all in this fascinating network, web, connected mess. And what each of us is individually doesn't matter nearly as much as how we're connected to others.
Good answer. I like that. All right, something to think about. Well, Ronnie, it is always a pleasure to catch up and talk to you. Thank you for being on the show. Before we wrap up, though, if somebody wanted to learn more about you, about your work, anything else that you're involved with, where would you direct them to go?
You could go to my blog. I've been working a little too hard, so it hasn't been super active, but ronniezeiger.com, and there's a contact page. I love getting questions and ideas and thoughts from people. So that's an easy one-stop shop.
Okay. All right, great. And to learn more about Smart Patients?
Smartpatients.com works.
All right, there you go. Well, thanks again, Ronnie. Great having you on the show. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hi again. It's me, Dr. G. If you are still listening, I'm hoping it's because you enjoyed this podcast. If you would like to hear future episodes, you could really help me out by subscribing to the That's Unusual podcast on iTunes and leaving a review. It goes a long way in helping me get the word out from avid listeners like you. As a thank you, I will be selecting 1 new reviewer each week at random for a free private 15-minute phone conversation where you can ask me anything and get professional advice on your career or business to help you stand out and make a difference. Also, if you want to be notified of any future episodes, please visit that'sunusualpodcast.com and sign up to receive updates on new episode releases. Until next time, remember to always think unusual.